If God had never given the 10 Commandments, the Seven Noahide Laws, or the rest of the Bible, would we still be obligated to act morally? The answer seems obvious. No. If God never commanded us, how could He expect us to act morally and follow Him? After all, it's much easier for humans to be bad, right? Even if we can perceive that some things are good and some things are bad, how could we even know that God wants and expects us to follow the good? Judaism actually says that had God never commanded, we would still be obligated to act on what our moral reason tells us. So if on our own we perceive that murder is wrong, then we would be obligated not to murder. But again, how could this be? How does reason, our moral reason, obligate us? And why would God expect us to follow our natural morality even without His commands? To answer these questions, let's first define what we mean by morality and reason and the intellect. As we elaborated in this video, all humans have a core moral intuition. All humans can intuitively recognize that certain things are good and certain things are bad. This basic moral awareness is universal, and the sources say that we can arrive at these truths through our intellect. At the same time, though, moral intuition has limits. It doesn't easily resolve complex moral cases, edge scenarios, or complex questions of scope and application. For example, we can easily perceive that the murder of an innocent human being is wrong. But what about self-defense? What about abortion or accidental murder? For these more complex moral cases where humans disagree, the revelation at Mount Sinai plays a crucial role. It clarifies these moral truths for us. But that also raises another question. If God had never commanded at Mount Sinai, would we still be obligated to follow the moral truths that we just naturally perceive? In other, more philosophical words, does recognizing that something is right or wrong actually bind you? Or is morality merely something that we just know but don't actually have to do without God's commands? Let's take a clear example and then we'll provide the answer. Again, virtually all human beings recognize that killing an innocent person for fun is wrong. But would we still be obligated not to do that, even if God never told us? Judaism's answer is yes. Murder was wrong before Sinai. Theft was wrong before Sinai. In fact, we see many times in the Bible that God judged humanity many times before Mount Sinai. Now, it's true, Judaism does teach that God did command before Sinai, specifically the Seven Noahide Laws to both Adam and Noah, but Judaism also holds that moral obligation does not depend on having heard, remembered, or properly transmitted those commands. After all, commands can be forgotten, distorted, or inaccessible. And yet, God still held people accountable. Why and how could God do this? The answer is because the wrongness of their actions was accessible to human reason. For example, the generation of the flood was not punished because they violated a technical statute that they had forgotten. They were punished because the world was full of violence, something they could and should have recognized as corrupt. Indeed, the classical Jewish sources say that normative reason genuinely obligates. In Hebrew, this reason is called Sevarah, often described as sound common sense or reasoning. But it's not just mere feeling or formal logic. It more adequately refers to reason recognizing what must be the case for justice, responsibility, and human life to make sense. And most humans never argue about what this Sevarah, this reason, informs. It's one of those universal human truths that everybody just agrees upon. At this point, though, we still haven't explained how recognizing right and wrong turns into obligation, only that Judaism assumes that it does. So how does normative reason, this Sevarah, actually obligate us? To understand how reason obligates, we need to first understand what kind of obligation we are talking about. Reason does not obligate like God's commands. It obligates by setting standards of justification, standards for what can count as a reason for an action. Whenever we explain our actions saying, "I did this because," we are already committed to a norm. Not everything can count as a reason. Some explanations justify an action, others don't. If someone says, "I crossed the street because there weren't any cars in my way," that's a valid reason for crossing the street. But if someone says, "I crossed the street because 2 plus 2 equals 5, that is not a reason, because 2 plus 2 equals 5 has no explanatory connection to the action. The moment we distinguish between reasons that make sense and reasons that don't, we are already inside normativity, what you should do, the norms of reasoning. And these norms are not just invented or chosen. They are built into what it means to reason. And this has immediate consequences. If you are reasoning, certain things are no longer available to you. If you are reasoning, you cannot treat contradictions as acceptable. You cannot treat arbitrary preferences as legitimate justifications. And you cannot accept reasons only when they benefit you and ignore them when they don't. This is what I'll call level 1 obligation. It's an obligation of correctness, not obedience to commands. To violate it is not to just fail a rule, it's to fail to reason. If you make contradictions, then you aren't reasoning. And this reasoning is important because it tracks truth in this world. And it goes further. Reason is an activity aimed at guiding action over time. It presupposes planning, predictability, trust, and stable connections between effort and outcome. So, if a pattern of action predictably destroys those conditions, then it undermines the very possibility of reason-guided action. At that point, no rational agent can coherently justify such an action. To do so would require relying on reasoning to justify an action that makes reasoning ineffective, which is a contradiction. This is what I call level 2 obligation. Some kinds of actions are unjustifiable for rational agents, us, because they undermine the conditions that justification itself presupposes. Reason cannot justify destroying itself, because that would be a contradiction. So this is why I think Jewish sources treat Sevarah, this normative reason, as genuinely binding. Because anybody who reasons is already subject to the standards of correctness that reasoning requires. But here we reach a crucial limit, and it's the difference between reason and command. Reason obligates only so long as a person is committed to being a rational agent. It says, if you are reasoning, if you are offering justifications, if you are acting as a rational agent, then these constraints follow necessarily, no contradictions. But here's the problem. A person can always refuse to care. They can choose power, impulse, or convenience over reason. At that point, reason doesn't just disappear, it still renders what they do irrational, but it can't compel their obedience, because reason cannot give a reason to follow itself if you don't care about reason. It's just circular reasoning. So this is why Judaism insists that Sevarah, normative reason, is genuinely obligating, but it's not ultimate. Divine command does what reason alone cannot do. God's commands bind not because we agree with them, and not because we care, but they bind because they come from the source of existence. Ultimate obligation can only come from the source of reality. Since God is the source of existence, to go against God is to go against yourself. It is to wish against your existence while still existing. It doesn't make any sense. But it doesn't even matter if you want to make sense, because God's commands are binding whether you like it or not. Even after all of this, one might still object. Well, what if I don't care about following God's commands? Isn't it the same as if I don't care about following reason? The answer is no. There's a big difference between God's obligation and reason's obligation. Reason only binds inside reasoning. So if you're reasoning, reason binds. But if you're outside reasoning, you choose not to reason, then reasoning can't bind you. But you reason all the time, so it kind of does. But anyway, in contrast, God's commands encompass all of existence. You can't get outside of them. You can reject them, you can ignore them, or disobey them, but you cannot place yourself outside of their scope because they encompass all of existence. So if you say you don't care about God's commands, that doesn't just cancel the obligation. It only means that you are refusing to acknowledge your obligation. The commands remain binding on you whether you accept them or reject them. But some people think that it is more reasonable to not follow God and to only follow their reason. Thus, we will move to what exactly Sevarah, reason, can establish on its own. How far can reason go before it needs commands? Since most of us operate within the norms of reason constantly, this question is extremely important. So what can reason actually establish without command? At the minimum, it can establish that certain kinds of actions are unjustifiable for any rational agent. Specifically, we should be asking, which actions, by their predictable structure, systematically undermine the conditions of rational agency, the conditions that allow one to reason, and therefore cannot be coherently justified by a rational agent. To see how this works, let's take one clear example, murder. By murder, we mean the unjustified killing of a rational agent. Reasoning is an activity that unfolds over time. To act for reasons, a person must first consider options, deliberate, and then act, and then bear responsibility for the outcome. All of these presuppose continued existence. Not indefinitely, but at least long enough for a reason to connect the choice of the action to the outcome. But murder destroys that condition entirely. It eliminates the rational agent altogether, reducing the time to zero. An agent with no future can't deliberate, can't reason. Rational agency collapses. So what would happen if murder were generally permitted? Well, you can guess. Planning would collapse, trust would collapse, responsibility would collapse. Importantly, rational agents could not rely on their continued existence, and reason-guided action would become impossible. Murder, therefore, is structurally incompatible with rational agency. Again, reason cannot justify an action that destroys reason. That's a contradiction. Murder destroys reason. Therefore, no rational agent can coherently justify murder without undermining the very activity that they rely upon when they try to justify murder. To justify murder would require appealing to reason to justify an action that gets rid of reason. And this is why we can say that within reason, murder is objectively wrong. Even before command, even before Sinai, reason alone excludes it. Interestingly, this reason arrives at each of the 7 Noahide laws, and in the coming videos we will show how this is done. Admittedly, this philosophical enterprise is original and unprecedented. Yes, some parts of it are borrowed, but the connections have not yet been made. But as I currently see it, it is the best for wise Noahides. However, following reason is ultimately inferior to following God's commands, and in another video we can show that. To summarize though, even if God never commanded, reason obligates us within the bounds of reason. If you break a rule of reasoning, then you are outside of reason, you're not reasoning. To be outside of reason is unjustifiable, so you can't argue that it's better to be outside of reason. Ultimately, however, reason cannot bind like God's commands. God's commands make one duty-bound whether one accepts them or not. If one rejects God, however, reason can arrive at certain objective truths because reason cannot justify anything that destroys the conditions that reason needs to operate. This is a philosophy for the wise. I hope you enjoyed, learned something. Thank you, as always, for watching.